Hello! Have you ever wanted to talk about climate change, but you pause because you're worried that it will be a conversation stopper? Well, if you have, then I'm with you. I have that feeling too. I want to talk about it, but I worry that if I do, it will be like those scenes in the old Western films where you walk into the saloon and the music stops and the merriment stops and the conversation stops and everyone turns to look at you, demanding to know who dared to disturb the peace. It shouldn't be like that, and I also don't think it needs to be like that. We need to talk about climate change because for a lot of us, we're anxious about the future. We don't know what it's going to be like in 10 years and 5 years, and for me, I'm scared about what we'll see in 6 months from now when we're in our next summer. But the anxiety about climate change gets compounded by the anxiety of talking about climate change. And if we could talk more about climate change, we'd all cope better. We'd see that we're not alone. We'd learn ways to cope and to adapt and find out ideas for what we can do to try to stop the future world from getting as bad as it might be. So we should all go forth and talk about climate change. But does that make you bristle? I know that that still makes me feel a little bit uneasy. And that can be because we feel like we're the one and only. We're alone in wanting to talk about climate change. But something that not many people realise is actually the vast majority of Australians hold views that are in line with the best available scientific evidence that we have about climate change. And for the record, that's that the globe is warming, our climate's changing, and that human beings are responsible. So, knowing that, go ahead. But it really doesn't feel that way. And in fact, we also know that Australians think that other Australians who think that climate change is happening is actually in a minority. And so what we have there is a perception gap, a gap between the reality and our perception of the reality. And this is difficult, but one way that we can deal with the perception gap is to talk about climate change. But even knowing that there's a majority of Australians who hold views in line with the best scientific evidence, I think we all still feel a little bit uneasy. And a big cause for that is that climate change is, despite what we've just talked about with public opinion, it is a divisive issue. In fact, it's been described as one of the most divisive political issues for Australia of the last decade. And so how do we make sense of this disjoint between the majority of public opinion and the divisiveness of climate change? And I think we can start to make sense of it by thinking about climate change and the discourse about it as happening in two levels. So at one level, we have the issue of climate change. When we engage at this level, we think about what are the causes? What does the evidence tell us? What do we need to do to deal with it? But that gets obscured by another level that sits on top of it. And this level is where we focus on why do I dislike the person who's telling me about climate change? And why do I want to fight with them about climate change? And we need to understand this level that's going on if we want to be able to have good conversations. And so fortunately, we've actually got decades and decades of research that we can draw on to make sense of this complex space here. And this is what my research looks at. I learn from social psychology to understand the nature of the way people relate to each other about these complex issues. And if we look at the research about when an issue becomes in this conflict space, it doesn't let us really engage with the substantive nature of the issue. We see a few predictable dynamics emerge. And I could talk for literal hours about what goes on here, but I'll just focus on a couple of key points. So one thing is that we end up with in-groups. In-groups associated with the idea. Now, an in-group is a group of people that share a sense of shared identity. And when we have an in-group, we tend to be favourable toward those in our in-group. We trust the things that they tell us, and if they do something that's a little bit dubious, we tend to be charitable in the way we interpret it. But in contrast to the in-groups, we also have out-groups. And the way that we relate to the out-groups is different. We tend to be suspicious of the outgroups. If we get a message from an outgroup member, we might not trust it. And if an outgroup member does something a bit dubious, we often see the worst in it. And so when we end up with an issue like climate change in this groupish context, we often find that the in-group and the out-groups find reasons to disagree with each other. They don't seek reasons for agreement or common ground. So when we're thinking about talking about climate change, what does this look like? Well, to me, it looks like following the script. We say the sorts of things that are the tired old tropes that we hear before, the sound bites from the media, from the politics. We talk about the issue in a way that is less about the issue of climate change and much more about who we are as a person, but critically, also who we're not. And I tend to think of it as being following the script as kind of like making the first move in a dance. You step in one way so the person you're speaking with knows exactly what they should do. You see what their move is, so you make the predictable move. And the thing is that we follow these dance moves, we follow the script, and we end up going down the same old familiar path that takes us to that awkward saloon with the dead silence and accusing glares. So, we should all talk about climate change, but we should try to disrupt the script when we talk about it. That's fine, but if you're like me, you still feel a little bit of discomfort. And I've stayed awake at night worrying about this in the hopes that other people won't have to. And I think there's two dilemmas that we really need to be aware of when we think about focusing on the way we have conversations about climate change. And that to do with the importance and the urgency of climate change. So first, on the importance of climate change, it can kind of feel like if we accept this model of climate change, that by focusing on what's going on in this space of social conflict, that we're not paying enough attention to the material issue at hand. It can feel in some ways like if we focus on the nature of our relationships, that we're turning a blind eye to the intentional bad faith efforts that certain actors have taken. But for the most part, those of us that are looking to have conversations about climate change, we're not actually talking to the executives of the fossil fuel companies who we know had internal evidence about what their business actions were doing to the climate, but still put out a PR campaign that spread misinformation instead. We're normally just talking to other everyday Aussies or everyday earthlings who are trying to make sense of the world, trying to find their place in the world, dealing with getting their kids to school, paying their bills, their rent, their mortgage. So instead of thinking about the way we talk about climate change as potentially undermining the importance of the issue, from my perspective, it's elevating the audience. It's recognizing that we might need to step into awkward, uncomfortable spaces to try to reset the way we talk about this issue. And so on to the second issue, and this is the urgency of climate change. Now, we should have acted yesterday, we should have acted 10 years ago, we should have acted 50 years ago, because this has been known for quite some time. And an important clarification when I say we, maybe I should say those who have had the power to do so should have acted. But nonetheless, we've ended up in this space. It's not our fault, it's the fault of the delay in the past. And we have to recognise that now this is the reality of climate change. And so it's a difficult thing to recognise that the urgency of climate change might demand slower conversations. Conversations that bypass the sound bites that get us to that core point that we want to get to, and instead focus on a meandering conversation with lots of listening and lots of thinking and finding novel and original ways to talk about climate change. Now, just because we've identified the dilemmas doesn't mean they go away. This is by no means an optimal situation, but I still genuinely believe that better conversations about climate change are good. They're good for us as people if they help us to cope and help us to understand and help us to feel left alone. But I think there is also the potential that with good conversations, we might be able to deal with the mess of the social conflict and political conflict about climate change, to then be able to focus on the issue underneath. But what does that mean? If you want to disrupt the script and have meaningful conversations, the most important thing from my perspective is that you speak from the heart. Try to find ways to express how you feel authentically. Avoid the sound bites, avoid the scripts, avoid the tired old tropes. Listen and try to understand, and that might be part of the solution to this important, urgent, pressing issue of climate change. Thank you.